Alright, so as promised, today we're going to start looking at how to actually write some music. And we're going to start with a very simple chord progression. We're going to look at a 1, 5, 1 progression. And that's about as simple as we could hope for. There are only 2 chords here. So we're going to take kind of a 2-step process to this. First, we're just going to look at what's going on musically from a theoretical standpoint. Like, what does 1, 5, 1 mean? What should this sound like musically? What's supposed to happen when we do a 1, 5, 1 progression? And then kind of step 2 is to look at what can we actually do with this. We take this 1, 5, 1 progression, how do we use it in a practical musical sense to actually do things? And that's kind of the music writing part. That's taking the theory and actually applying it to making a real song. So there'll still be a lot of theory involved with this, at least at the beginning, but we're going to kind of take it a step further and look at the more practical side. So to start with, let's just go over what this actually is, this 1, 5, 1 progression. If you remember, a 1 chord is just the chord built on the first note in our key, or we actually call that the root note. Chord 5 is the chord built on the 5th note in the key. So if we chose a key, like say the key of D, this is our 1 chord because it's built on note number 1. This is our 5 chord because it's on note number 5. And then for our progression, we're going back to the 1 chord. Now musically, what's supposed to happen here is we're supposed to be moving the music from a very restful, comfortable sound into this kind of tense, like tight, needing to resolve kind of sound, and then back into that comfortable part. And the reason that happens is because we're starting on our 1 chord, and every chord kind of has a different job in a key. Our 1 chord is our very comfortable chord. It's built on the root note, and remember, that's kind of the center of everything. Everything wants to kind of move back into that root note. So that's our comfortable part of the music. Our 5 chord has kind of the opposite role musically. That chord has a lot of tension to it. It's like the farthest away from our 1 chord, and it really wants to get pulled back into our 1 chord. It has this like need to resolve, is what you would call it. So our progression here, at least, is supposed to move from that comfortable sound to that tension sound, like it wants to move back to our 1 chord, and then it finally does, and it kind of moves back into our restful sound. So let me play that for you again. You can actually just listen to it and try to get a sense for what this is doing. Here's our 1 chord, 5 chord, 1 chord. Here it is without me talking. Okay, so if you listen to that, you might notice that it's actually not all that convincing. That restful sound, tension sound, and then restful sound. That's what's supposed to happen, but it kind of isn't, at least when I play it this way. The reason why it's not working, or at least not working very well, has to do with the reasons behind why these chords make these different sounds. So we have to go a little bit deeper to understand why this is supposed to happen and how to make it sound better in a practical musical sense. So forget the chords for a second. Let's just look at the notes in the key. So here's our key of D major. And this note, right here, note number 7, this is the one that's interesting to us right now. This is what's called the leading tone. And the leading tone is the note right just a half step below the root note. You can think of it as being like right on the edge. It really wants to resolve into that root note. When you hear it, just your brain kind of interprets it as needing to get pulled into that root note. Here it is. If you just play through the scale, you can hear it. It's right on the edge, and it wants to move into there. And that's what's kind of driving our 5 chord. When we play the 5 chord, the middle note of that chord is that leading tone. And that leading tone really wants to move into our root note. So the reason why this didn't work so well when I played it was because when I played this 5 chord and I had this leading tone right here, this is like pulling into this note here, this root note, and I don't actually let it resolve into that root note. I just kind of jump down and play the chord down here. So that's why this doesn't actually work that well. So the way to fix this, the way to make this sound a little more convincing, is to get a little more creative with the chords and actually try to get this leading tone to move into the root note. That should make this chord progression sound much more convincing. So instead of playing everything in root position, which is what this is, you want to kind of expand the chords a little, maybe invert them or do whatever we need to do to get this to work. So I'll do it this way. Let's say I take this D chord and I add an extra D on top. That kind of gives me a target for this leading tone here. I can resolve it into this root note now that I put it up here. And for the 5 chord, instead of playing it here, I'm actually going to move the E down here, so I've inverted the chord. Then I'm going to move this now, actually going to double it up and put it down there also. So now I actually have 2 leading tones. But that's okay because when I move into this chord, I'm actually taking both of those and resolving them into root notes. So that should make this a much more convincing chord movement. I'm starting on actually 2 root notes here, moving into a leading tone and then resolving those back into the root note. And beyond just the leading tone root note movement, I'm doing a much better job of avoiding that jumping around kind of sound. This, as I said before, is very clunky. The chords just kind of move in big blocks. But this, everything is much more woven together. I get a much smoother movement from one chord to the next. So as far as what else you can do, we don't have a lot of options today. So far, we have not covered melody yet. And that's kind of the next step. We want to fit some melody along with this. Now we could apply some rhythm here to these chords. We could do a couple basic things. One thing we could do is just kind of play through the notes, like top to bottom, or bottom to top. That adds a little bit of movement to the chord. And that could be a nice sort of rhythmic gesture. One thing we could do is actually move this root note down lower. And do kind of like a 1, 2, 3, sort of a waltz rhythm. Oops. And that could work well. But really, without a melody on here, we're not really sure what to do with the chords, because we kind of need to know what's going to be happening in the melody to decide how this is going to fit. And if you just kept it at this very simple progression, it's going from 1, 5, back to 1, nothing fancy. This might seem kind of boring sounding. It's very simple, but that could actually be a very good thing, because in a lot of cases, our melody is going to be the interesting part. That's what's going to move, and kind of when you listen to the music, that's what you're going to be listening to is the melody. So if our chords are jumping around a lot and they're very kind of distracting, or they kind of draw your attention down here, that could take away from our melody and kind of not work that well with the song overall. So without knowing what we're doing up here yet, maybe keeping this simple and boring is a good thing, because maybe that will make this work better. But next lesson, we will be looking at how to actually work a melody over top of the chords. And that's where we'll have a lot more options as far as what we can do music-wise. So that's going to be it for now, just a simple chord progression and the mechanics of why it works and what you can do with it. Obviously, there's a lot more chords in a key. We just looked at 2 of them, but we are also going to look at how to go to a 2 chord or a 6 chord and what they're going to do, or a 7 chord. All those different ones kind of have their own job to do, and we're going to look at each one of those individually. But next week, we're going to not do that. We spent a lot of time on chords. We're going to look at melody, and that should open up a lot of options for us. So that's it for today. Play around with that, and I'll see you next time.